In this video, you're going to hear from Lorena Diaz, a bilingual Spanish-English speech-language pathologist who is also Puerto Rican-American. She's on the Bilingual Extension Institute faculty at Teachers College, Columbia University with me as both an instructor and also as a master clinician mentor. She's going to talk about how she has changed how evaluations are done everywhere she's worked to move them to be more culturally and linguistically appropriate, especially for bilingual kids, and also more consistent with the law and the research.
Hello, I'm Lorena Diaz, and I'm a bilingual SLP currently working in a small city in New York State. I'm going to share my personal challenges in providing evaluations that are both reliable and fair for the bilingual population. At the start of my career during my CFY, I worked at a preschool in the Bronx where my caseload consisted mainly of children where Spanish was the primary language in the home. Most of my students' families were primarily from the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, and from Mexico. Since my family is from Puerto Rico and I have a background very similar to my students in terms of language acquisition, as well as socioeconomic status, I felt great about being able to help these children in the best way I knew how. I was excited and eager to put into my professional practice everything I had learned in grad school about assessment. And I did so right away, as there was apparently a huge need. I had been taught that you evaluate students with the standardized test, at the time was the PLS-3, in both languages, score it, and the results would answer the imperative question as to if the child had a speech disorder. Simple, neat, and clear cut. However, after administering a few tests in this manner, I knew there had to be a better way. With the PLS, I felt there were unreasonable expectations in terms of time and attention to task for students who were so young. But more impactfully, these results were not reading the kids right. Very often, these children that the testing suggested had a language disorder, I would then see for treatment, and most of them would be able to follow multi-step directions, tell a story cohesively, answer questions with relevant answers, and so on. Here I would have these students in front of me accomplishing all these tasks, often with ease, yet the test was finding all sorts of issues with comprehension, following directions, and recall. I took my Bilingual Extension Institute at Teachers College, which answered a lot of my questions, and I read the relevant research. I learned why my results were not a clear representation of these children, as well as all these other evaluations that I was coming across. They weren't accurate either. Our findings were not coinciding with the students' abilities. Many of these children were misdiagnosed, and being misdiagnosed can have long-lasting effects. I needed to assess in a culturally responsive way in order to get accurate results. Armed with this new knowledge and with a renewed sense of purpose, I assessed my first student using culturally responsive research-based methods, and I handed in my report to my supervisor. I had explained some of what I was learning already at an in-service to the speech department, and I hoped that seeing it on paper, they would be excited too. Instead, the report was returned to me with the directive to redo it and put the scores in. You can't hand in a report like that, I was told. This was definitely not the reaction I was hoping for. I felt upset, embarrassed, and frustrated. I called the school director and asked for a meeting so I could discuss this report, and also why I no longer felt comfortable conducting reports the way they had been done in the past. The director listened and was kind in her demeanor, but ultimately I was told to keep using standardized tests and to continue inputting scores. Needless to say, I was crushed. They were asking me to potentially label a child as having a disorder when they do not have one. To label a child with a disorder when they do not have one has lasting repercussions in terms of limiting their growth, their potential, both academically and just in their life in general. It is not accurate. Interestingly enough, the same agency I worked for had several schools across the city, one being in Manhattan. The school in Manhattan accepted culturally responsive evaluations. So I requested a transfer that was granted, and I was then able to work in an ethical manner. My next phase as an SLP took me to the New York City Department of Education, where I was one of 5 speech therapists in an elementary school. I was the sole bilingual provider, and I began conducting evaluations for the DOE. These evaluations needed to be reviewed by a bilingual speech supervisor before being accepted. This created some tension, as she often did not agree with my findings or understand the way I conducted the evaluations, as they were presented in a descriptive manner rather than score-based. I received a lot of pushback from the bilingual speech supervisor, and she would actively attempt to have me change my findings. We had several discussions where I spoke to her about what I had learned and the repercussions of continuing to rely on standardized testing for our population. And over time, the bilingual supervisor began researching appropriate evidence-based practice and enhanced her knowledge base with trainings. She slowly began to change her views and actually became a strong advocate for conducting evaluations fairly. I then moved to a small city and faced a new host of challenges. Here, I found that though some of the SLPs where I worked did not report scores, they were still using standardized tests such as the SELF, the ROW PVT, EOW PVT in their entirety. So even though scores were not reported, the children were often misdiagnosed continuously, as their results were essentially still based on those tests that are often measuring aptitude with standard American English, rather than if a child has a speech and language disability. Luckily, the speech chairperson was open to discussing why my evaluations were done differently than other bilingual SLPs. The chairperson often had to participate in IEP meetings where I was not present and review my speech evaluations to the entire team. In doing so, she came to understand why it was so important to use methods that were culturally responsive. At this point, I was untenured, an at-will employee, meaning they didn't need a reason to let me go. They could just do so at any time. I had a meeting with the superintendent of special education where I explained my evaluations and why I relied heavily on dynamic assessment and used a descriptive manner rather than standardized tests. However, the superintendent could not understand why the bilingual SLPs in the district were not all on the same page. Why was it that if what I was saying was correct, I was the only one doing it that way out of several bilingual SLPs? And that question was a difficult one to answer. I just kept stating that I was following evidence-based best practice from my students. I shared research. I kept explaining what's in my power to do. Whatever was in my power to do, I did. Whether or not I would lose my job, I needed to continue servicing these kids. There's no reason why they should be labeled as having a disability when they do not. That is unacceptable. In the end, culturally responsive evaluations are not only fair and just, they are accurate. The results of an evaluation using methods that don't distinguish between a difference and a disorder is inaccurate and a disservice to the population we serve. Though I continue to face challenges and obstacles in providing evidence-based and culturally responsive evaluations, there really is no choice. There's no other way but what is just and what is fair. Though it's often an uncomfortable position to be in and it feels uncertain, it can be tough. Not everybody's on board, not everybody understands, and they're not familiar with what the research states. Having said that, there is no other way to go about this but to keep going one day at a time. Though I had challenges, I still received tenure at 2 different workplaces. I was never left without work. I may have had to transfer, but I was able to sleep at night then. And a crucial discussion began. At my current workplace, no one is using scores. Dynamic assessment is beginning to happen in evaluations. And tomorrow there's actually a speech department meeting where we're going to discuss why there's disproportionate referral, especially at the secondary level. The discussion continues, and it's very necessary. To be a bilingual SLP often goes hand in hand with being an advocate. The opportunity to create change is both an honor and a privilege. Will you be an agent of change?
This video and a number of others showing our change makers will go together to form an online course available at leadersproject.org that will also be offered for ASHA CEUs. It will be free, and you will meet your ethical and culturally responsive requirements